Hey YouTube, Bob here. In this final installment of the 10-year anniversary edition of Nintendo Unboxed, we're going to be revisiting the Game Boy adapters. If you're interested in seeing my original unboxing of these adapters, you can click the link to that in the description for this video. Before we get into the first adapter, which takes the form of the Super Game Boy, let me take you back in time a little bit to the year 1994, when I was 14 years old and thought that the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, Nintendo's dominant 16-bit home console, was all the rage, because it was. But previous to that, I had had an 8-bit Nintendo Entertainment System, which I had passed on to my brother, and I even did have a Game Boy, Nintendo's portable handheld at the time, but I had sold that at a garage sale thinking that the Super Nintendo was the only thing I needed. Because, you know, at the tender, ripe old age of 14, I thought I knew it all, and I always wanted to move on to the next biggest thing and kind of shed things from the past, or from what I considered to be my childhood. So I thought the Super Nintendo was the best thing ever. And I wasn't wrong, but what I didn't realize is that even though my friends and I typically considered Game Boy games to be the lesser of the two between Super Nintendo and Game Boy, for instance, Super Mario Land was not nearly as good as Super Mario World, as the Game Boy went on through its life, a lot of those games did get to be just as good as their 16-bit home console counterparts. And The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening is a prime example of that on Game Boy. If you compare it to The Legend of Zelda Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, that one has just about as much depth as the home console version. So I think that might have been the reason that Nintendo thought that adapters to be able to play those portable games on your home console was the way to go. So that's what we got in 1994 in the form of the Super Game Boy, a Super NES accessory. So I think they wanted to clarify that there because they're kind of mixing their two platforms here. Is this Game Boy? Is this Super Nintendo? So right on the cover here it tells you that it's a Super NES accessory and that you can play your Game Boy games in color on your Super Nintendo Entertainment System. This one that I have here is the small box version. There is a big box version, kind of similar in size to the packaging of Earthbound, to accommodate an included player's guide. And I don't have the big box version, but I do have the Super Game Boy Player's Guide, which features some full color screenshots of the games, and it says the complete guide to the colorful side of Game Boy. So when we open this up here, we can see some table of contents, connection and usage, options, custom colors, changing borders, customizing colors, and then we get into several of the games that are featured in this player's guide. As we go to the first page, you can see that it's telling you how the Super Game Boy adapter will interface with your Super Nintendo Entertainment System and how you insert the games in there. How it works with the different controllers, the standard, and the mouse, which was used more to create some custom color palettes and borders that we'll be able to see on the following pages here. When Nintendo knows that they're kind of reselling you one of their previous products, be it a Mario game they're reissuing, they tend to throw in a couple bonus features, and there are no shortage of bonus features here in the Super Game Boy. It shows you how you can use the mouse to access all the color palette icons, color icons, border icon. You can add a whole bunch of different personal touches to the borders around the actual game field. There's some good examples here on the previous page where we see we've got Tetris, a little bit of a custom color palette for the game, but then around it is a custom border to fill in the empty space. So the first several pages of the guide are dedicated to making some customizations. Be it the color palette of your actual game, you could move beyond the three-toned green color scheme of the Game Boy and add some different colors to your games. And then you can add some of the preset borders that were stored right on the Super Game Boy cartridge itself, and you can even make some customizations to that. So that's what the first part of the player's guide is all about. Moving into the second part of the player's guide, talks about specific games, and the first one is Super Mario Land, which was pretty much a launch title way back in 1989 when the Game Boy first debuted. But shows some of the customized color palettes and some of the custom borders around the screen. And then the guide continues on showing different games. Here we've got Wario Land, Donkey Kong, and Donkey Kong 94 was one of the games that I think released right alongside the Super Game Boy. It was kind of the showpiece for the Super Game Boy. You see that very cool Donkey Kong arcade cabinet border around the screen there. This was one of the games where some additional features could be unlocked if you used it in the Super Game Boy. So, some more Easter eggs that Nintendo included there in this player's guide to kind of go through some of those for a couple of their first-party games. But getting back to the actual Super Game Boy itself, we got typical Super NES style packaging in the United States. And the text says, play all your Game Boy games on your Super NES in color. Insert your Game Boy game pack into the Super Game Boy accessory and watch your game appear on TV in brilliant colors. Play more than 350 Game Boy titles on your Super NES. Paint your own custom border and choose from 9 pre-programmed designs. Stereo sound on any television with stereo speakers, because the Game Boy did have stereo. Maximize your play control by using the Super NES controller. Game Boy game pack sold separately. And then they have a new icon right here that says, look for this symbol on Game Boy game pack specifically programmed for the Super Game Boy, because they typically had extra features. The Donkey Kong game that I referenced says specially designed for Super Game Boy, as does Metroid 2. It says, guide Samus through a sinister planet with Game Boy. Maybe you won't feel quite so cramped on your Game Boy screen if you were to play it on the Super Game Boy. So let's open up the box and see what we have here. Kind of a custom tray to accommodate the larger size of the cartridge. Documentation includes the instruction manual, consumer precautions, the obligatory Nintendo Power subscription, and then your poster that is featuring some of the popular games of the time. Star Fox, most prominently here. And then on the back is Star Fox, of course, but a thinly veiled advertisement for joining the Super Power Club, aka getting a subscription to Nintendo Power. So let's take a look and see what the instruction manual has to say. Probably a lot of the same things as the player's guide that we first took a look at. It is in color, which is nice. How to make your connections. And of course it's going to go through and show you how to use all those customization features with the in-game color palettes and the borders, the preloaded ones, and then of course how to make your own custom borders, which was a fun feature using the mouse. So rather colorfully engaging instruction manual for the Super Game Boy. Even the warranty and service information is in color. I've never seen that before. So there's the manual. Let's take a look and see the Super Game Boy itself. So it definitely does look like a US NTSC game pack, right down to that this little barred or striped motif on either side, which goes all the way up and down the cartridge on the back. Can't remember if this originally came with a dust cover or not. I'm guessing not, because 94 was right around the time when Nintendo stopped providing these, but I do add them to all my games that don't have them. But your Game Boy game would sit right in this cartridge slot here. This would be inserted into your Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and it would interface with the pin connector on the bottom. And we're noticing that it's using the extra pins here, obviously to communicate some of the extra data or information needed to be able to run a Game Boy game on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. So this actually turned out to be quite a popular accessory. It did well to really increase the amount of excellent games that you could play right on your Super Nintendo Entertainment System. One of the biggest drawbacks, however, though, and it wasn't at the time because the Game Boy Color had not yet been released, that would be about 4 years later, but this was not compatible with Game Boy Color games. And you'd think that with a Super Game Boy 2, which does exist, that Nintendo would actually include Game Boy Color compatibility. But that's not the case with this Japanese exclusive Game Boy 2. Let's take a look and see what that one's all about. So if it's not compatible with Game Boy Color games, what's the point of the Game Boy 2, and why did it see only a Japanese release? Well, as popular as Pokemon was in the United States, it was even more popular in Japan. And one of the main issues with the Super Game Boy is if you wanted to play the Pokemon games on your TV, there was no way to do any sort of transfer because the EXT port that was on the original Game Boy for data transmission was absent. So basically, the only thing that the Game Boy 2 adds is an EXT port and 2 LEDs to indicate your data transfer. I think there is an additional chip inside here that helps with some processing, but other than that, this is basically just a Super Game Boy that has data transfer capability. And it means that you can also play two-player games as well if you want to use a Game Boy, I think. That might have been one of the features. But inside the box we have the manual and we have the Super Game Boy 2 itself. I really do enjoy this aesthetic, this kind of neon line art of the actual hardware. But this, of course, is going to be all in Japanese, but almost as colorful as the manual we just took a look at for the US Super Game Boy. Using the Super Famicom controller. This one has even more, or at least different, preloaded borders, and I think it preserved the capability of being able to create your own custom borders for the games. But the main improvement of this Super Game Boy 2 is to be able to have data transfer, specifically for Pokemon games. Which was never an appeal to me because I never got into Pokemon. And using it with the Super NES mouse. Probably some warranty or precautionary information here. How to clean your Game Boy cartridges. So that's the manual for the Super Game Boy 2 in Japan. And the actual Super Game Boy 2 itself will come out and reveal a little bit more documentation. Let's take a look and see what we have here. Looks like we have a couple more warnings. This one appears to be about an AC adapter. This one seems to be listing a whole bunch of different parts. Maybe it's an order form for different parts. And then here we have a little bit of a quick reference card just for some basic features. Instead of digging through a manual, you've just got some of the basics on this handy little card that was included with some Super Famicom games as well. I remember specifically that Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, the Japanese version, included a quick reference card like this. But if we take a look at the hardware, kind of interesting that they went with this translucent blue. That was very similar to what was going on with a lot of Nintendo handheld products at the time. There were translucent Game Boys, there were some translucent Game Boy Colors, and this would lead you to believe even further that this was compatible with the Game Boy Color. But alas, we know that's not true. But if we compare it to the original Super Game Boy from the United States, we can see that the cartridge design is definitely more modeled after the Super Famicom and the PAL, or European Super Nintendo Entertainment System. And flipping them over to the back, not too much to see here. Just a label with warnings on it, and of course the motif of the plastic continues down throughout the back of the cartridge. So those are the first two Game Boy adapters in the form of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or Super Famicom. But with Nintendo's next console, we wouldn't see any sort of dedicated adapter for Nintendo portables at the time. It would skip the Nintendo 64 altogether, and the next adapter we would see would be in the form of the Game Boy Player for the GameCube. So let's take a look at that. Here we have the two regional variations of the Game Boy Player for the Nintendo GameCube. On the left we have the US NTSC version that unfortunately was sold in a plastic blister pack. So you could see the product through the plastic, but you weren't left with any sort of box or anything like that other than this piece of cardboard that had some information about the product. On the right, we've got the Japanese version of the Game Boy Player, and it a little bit more clearly illustrates what this was all about, showing how the Game Boy Player would interface with the bottom of the GameCube system, and how you would put your Game Boy Advance, or Game Boy Color, or Game Boy games into play. Because yes, this was compatible with all three of those platforms here. What we got in the United States was just a view of this chunky, blocky, in my opinion, most strangely shaped piece of plastic that I have ever seen in my life. What could this possibly be for? So I think we failed miserably with the packaging in the United States, but in Japan they got it right. And something else they got right in Japan were different colors. All we got in the United States was this black color, but in Japan they also had spice, and they had indigo to match the different colors of the GameCube systems at the time, and of course the platinum that we see here, and that's the one we'll unbox for the Japanese version. I think in Japan they also had black color. Before we get into unboxing the Japanese version here, let's take a look at what else came with the US NTSC version, which is this Game Boy Player startup disc. Since the GameCube was a disc-based system, it did need to be able to boot up to something. So that's what this startup disc was important to have. If you ever see a Game Boy Player in the wild, definitely be sure if you're going to buy it that it comes with this startup disc. It says, play more than 1,000 games designed for the original Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance handheld game systems. Also works with the e-reader accessory. Scan e-reader cards and play classic Nintendo games, Pokemon E, TCG, Animal Crossing E, and more. Control gameplay with a Nintendo GameCube controller, or plug in the Nintendo GameCube Game Boy Advance cable and use a Game Boy Advance system as a controller. The Game Boy Player matches the footprint of the Nintendo GameCube and quickly connects to the bottom, adding only 1 inch to the height. You can easily switch from playing Game Boy games to Nintendo GameCube games. Select from 20 different frame designs that border the game image on TV screen. So they did away with being able to create your own custom borders, but they really did have some nice ones here. But one thing that they did remember to include was an EXT port. So there was no reason to create a Nintendo Game Boy Player 2 like there was for the Super Game Boy 2. And as you can see, all this information on the back was kind of part of the packaging, because this was in the clear blister pack. This you would see on the back of the product as it was packaged. The back of this has just a little bit of information, but you would see this startup disc packaging in the back. So if we take it out of its cardboard slipcase here, you see we have an instruction booklet and the startup disc itself for the Game Boy Player. If we take the instruction booklet out, components, system setup, system operation, showing what all the different pieces of this very, very strangely shaped contraption are. how to have it interface with your GameCube system, putting the startup disc in, and inserting your your Game Boy, Game Boy Color, or Game Boy Advance game. Removing the startup disc and Game Boy pack. That's an interesting thing. I'll show you how that works. Removing the games. And some more instructions for system operation, and using your Game Boy Advance system as a controller, if that's something that you want to do. So basically, it's just an adapter like the Super Game Boy we took a look at. But since the Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games all had kind of a different size, the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color games would stick out enough to where you could actually grab them with your finger and pull them out. But the Game Boy Advance games, they would kind of sit flush with the front panel here, so you really couldn't get a good grab on it, which is why on the side here, there's a little bit of an eject lever. You push this forward and the game would kind of spit out halfway, and then you would be able to grab it with your fingers and pull it out the rest of the way. So let's take a look and see what was included with the Japanese proper packaging here inside of a box. This is the Platinum version. I do have the boxes here the box here for the Spice version. You can see it's pretty much the same thing. These are identical except for the color. Got some Game Boy branding on the short sides. And then on the back, shows you how to make it interface with the GameCube. Also shows you the different color variants. You do have Indigo, Spice, Jet Black, and Platinum Silver. And then some description and instructions on how to use it. So let's take a look and see what we have inside the Platinum box. See right away we've got the Game Boy player and the startup discs. That's always a good thing. If you're picking one of these up, you definitely want to be sure that it has the startup disc. These are separated by a little bit of a cardboard retainer tray here. We'll get to the hardware in a moment. Let's take a look at these startup discs first. This is interesting in that these cases are what GameCube games came in Japan. And then they included a little cardboard slip cover that had the game art on the front and then the description and the screenshots on the back. For the Game Boy player, for whatever reason, they decided not to include a slip cover like we actually did get in the United States. But our GameCube games came in more the standard size black DVD cases. But if we open this up, we've got the Game Boy player disc. And we have a precautions leaflet. And of course the manual. Very similar to the one that we went through for the US version. But of course this one is all in Japanese. With some nice photo illustrations here. Pretty much the same ones we saw in the US version. Of how to connect the parts and insert the games. But largely the processes are all the same. If we take a look at the Platinum Game Boy player, same deal. We've got the interface port right here that'll connect with the bottom of your GameCube. EXT port for data transfer or hooking up your Game Boy Advance to use as a controller. The cartridge slot, and on this side here the eject lever for getting out those hard to remove Game Boy Advance games. Although you could also use it with the standard Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. So there you have the Game Boy adapters and the finale of the 10-year anniversary edition of the Nintendo Unboxed playlist, in which I reshot several of my earlier videos that kinda needed an upgrade in the video quality. So I hope you enjoyed the series, and I'll stay tuned for other content that I'll have here for you at World of Nintendo. So until that next video, take care.